Okay, well thank you for the welcome, and it's nice to be here. So I'm normally at Melbourne School of Theology, which is out in the eastern suburbs and actually belongs in the what used to be the New Dramatics building over there near Eastlink. So it's funny how many people in Melbourne know where that is, and inevitably once I say that, they know what I'm talking about. So I've been there for about 2.5 years. I'm really a New South Welshman by nature. Came from pastoring for 6 years up in Queensland. My wife is a Queenslander. So I don't venture into inner city Melbourne very often actually. I'm not much of a city person. There's a fair bit of sort of country or the regions in me. Well, what I'd like to do this morning is give you a little bit of a taste of the history of interpretation of the creation week in Genesis 1. That was the subject of my study for my doctorate, and I really tried to focus simply on the framework of the 7 days and avoid getting too buried in the detail of things like the nature of humanity, the image of God, that kind of thing. So I still have a great reverence for Genesis chapter 1. I was just looking at it this morning, and oddly enough I discovered a couple of things I hadn't noticed there before in the detail of the chapter. But they're famous words, aren't they? In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. They would still be almost in the universal vocabulary of many parts of the world, many cultures. So Genesis 1 is unique. It opens the biblical canon. If you understand it, there's a biblical meta-narrative to be perceived there in the course of the Christian Bible, and it gets that meta-narrative underway. It's as primordial as you can be. There's nothing more original than the beginning, and it sets that theme in place immediately. Its scope is global, and it's of foundational theological importance as well. It sets in place, it begins to speak about the theological themes that will occupy the rest of the Bible. It displays literary grandeur. It's often called poetry, but it isn't actually poetry. It's fairly easy to tell what Hebrew poetry is like, and it's not poetry, but it is more than prose. It's elevated prose. It follows a kind of a series of formulae, but does so in a very exalted way. I think it shows great cultural restraint in the sense that it is not so strongly flavoured with its the texture of its cultural background that it doesn't make sense in another age. And yet at the same time it's really quite unique in its own context as well. You can read the nearest analogies you have in other ancient literature from the region, and there's nothing really that's quite the same as Genesis 1. Nothing close. So Richard Hess called it the single most reflected upon written text ever written in human history. He said, perhaps, because I don't know how you measure that. Scientifically that would be a challenging task, but I certainly discovered that something like it was the truth when I began to study that for my doctoral studies, which is why they took a decade, and I didn't really finish. Had to cut it off historically. So one thing I'm going to do this morning is give you a bit of a snapshot of the career of Genesis chapter 1, and what I mean by that is its cultural career, because one thing that interests me is that it rose from obscurity. Even in the Old Testament it's relatively obscure in that once you leave Genesis 2 verse 3, there's only 1 or 2 more references to the 7 days or the 6 days of creation in the rest of the Old Testament. It's really conspicuously absent from the rest of the Old Testament. That's not so much true of the literature that surrounded the formation of the Old Testament or came after it, the intertestamental literature, and into the New Testament. Allusions to the creation week begin to build up and become increasingly influential. So by the time of about 400 AD there is quite a powerful interest in what is an increasingly strong Christendom in the meaning of this chapter. It then enjoyed a cultural dominance of more than a millennium, and even in the Renaissance and lasting some way into the Enlightenment or the 18th century, it was really quite popular to frame your treatment of the way the world is. And there was a tradition of writing encyclopedias of sorts, and for a long time you could do it within the framework of Genesis 1. So one famous pioneering thinker just at the cusp of modern science developing, Marina Mersenne, wrote a commentary on Genesis 1 that lasted 700 or 800 pages in really dense double-column Latin. And so it's not a text that has been dominant from the start, and it no longer has the cultural dominance that it once did, but there was a long, long period in the middle of the time between New Testament times and ourselves when it really held the day as a text that explained the world. So I'll explain to you what I'm doing with this diagram. The tree represents the history of the interpretation of Genesis 1. The base represents, at the bottom, around about naught, the turning of the eras, BC to AD. And the tree represents the intertwined interpretations of the creation week. And I'm using this metaphor, and I found a particularly twisty tree, because as you study the way things have been read, the way Genesis 1 has been read and understood, it's quite varied, and yet there are continuities there to be seen. And so I'm going to attempt to pick out for you a couple of the threads of interpretation, starting with some that you might be more familiar with, and then moving on to some that will seem a little bit more alien or unfamiliar, and then revisit this issue of why it was that Genesis 1 came to dominance as the anchor for an entire culture's worldview, and then why it became marginalised in more recent centuries. So here are some of the more recent understandings, 20th century understandings of Genesis 1, in certain circles, but you may recognise some of these. Well, depth is to really say that some of these interpretations run further back than you might have realised. Okay, so the interpretation of the creation week in terms of 24-hour days, a literal week as such, it's sometimes claimed that is quite a recent innovation, that it's a response to modern science that's only 100 or 150 years old, and in some sense there's a truth in that because contexts change. But you can certainly find strands of the church that wanted to interpret the creation week literally, all the way back into the patristic period. There was a group called the Antiochenes, based in the Eastern Church, the Greek-speaking church, who really urged that the historical side of the Old Testament not be abandoned or neglected through allegory. And so they took that emphasis all the way back to Genesis 1 and viewed it as history. It emitted in eventually a rather, quite a literalistic understanding of the chapter, where it was understood to teach a geography that was really quite... Reading it now, it's a little bit comical. But there's quite continuity there. People talk about... Presbyterians in America have hot debates about this because they have to confess that they stand by the Westminster Confession to be ordained as ministers, and the Westminster Confession contains those words "in the space of 6 days," in reference to creation. And that was very common in the era of the Protestant Reformation and the Christian confessions of the Protestant churches. Moving on, it was popular for a time, it's less common now, but to talk about the gap theory, where the first chapter of Genesis was perceived to talk about absolute creation in verse 1, and then the creation week referred to the modelling of the world that we know, but all of the eras of geological change prior to human existence were kind of exegetically inserted into verse 2, the statement about the world being formless and void. And that grew out of a range of things, but even back in classical culture, there was the understanding that the world had emerged from chaos, and when the Renaissance came around, people were reading these texts again and paying them attention, and they could get them printed, of course, after the late 1400s. So they began to read Ovid and Hesiod and some of these famous figures from the BC era, and all of their statements about chaos inspired their thinking to imagine, well, perhaps that formless and void state lasted a long time, and once geology came along, they thought, well, perhaps, you know, the era of the dinosaurs, the era of the armoured fish, those eras could be slotted in there. They're just effectively skipped over in Genesis 1. So there was a lot of ancient baggage that went into making up that particular view, and it was a common exploration of those who thought, well, if Satan is somehow in the guise of the serpent in chapter 3, tempting Adam and Eve in the garden, then there must have already been an angelic fall. There must have been an angelic drama preceding the human drama. So that has quite old roots of thinking. Okay, so when we come to this view, it's essentially treating the creation week as a figurative representation of the geological eras. And so those for the last 250 years or so who've wanted to explain the creation week this way have done a lot of work as the character of geological eras became clear to try and describe how they fit the descriptions of each of the days in Genesis chapter 1. In my opinion, that takes a little bit of forcing at some places, but this was essentially a view that meant that Genesis 1 was not literal, but was still historical, if you can understand the difference. So it was not an abandonment of the historical nature of it, but it was seeing it as still talking about the physical world. Probably more common today is to view it as a framework or kind of a literary series of boxes that catch all of the different aspects of the created world, the seas, the land, the air, the heavenly bodies, and therefore this is actually not a literal interpretation. You will hear it said that this was pioneered in the early 20th century, but there were elements of it. One side of it is simply being aware of the literary characteristics of the chapter. And so commentators for centuries past have been noticing that days 1 to 3 in the creation week match up to days 4 and 6, or they correspond pretty well. So day 1 has the creation of light, day 4 has the creation of the light bearers, the heavenly lamps. Day 2 has the creation of sky and sea, dividing those two bodies. Day 5 has fish and birds. So there's a pretty clear correspondence between the two sets of 3 days, but that's no new discovery. That hasn't been found since the 20th century. A good example is Peter Lombard, the medieval figure who came up with the work called The Sentences, a kind of a series of theological proposals. He notes the parallelism between the days 1 to 3 and days 4 to 6. That's not mutually exclusive necessarily with literal interpretation, but people have been noticing those artistic elements of the chapter for a long, long time, and well back into Jewish tradition as well. Alright, so those are the things that views we're fairly familiar with, but that have deeper roots than we sometimes realise. I want to talk now about less familiar views, things that are a little bit more alien, but have played an important part on the scale of centuries in the way this chapter has been looked at. So we need to be prepared to think outside the box a little bit and come to terms with views that are based on worldviews we don't share necessarily anymore. So a bit of imagination is needed. Okay, a very important tradition all the way down has been those who've looked at the world from a Platonist point of view, based on Plato's thinking. And so he had a dualistic worldview, meaning the physical world was clearly distinguished from the non-material world, the ideal world, and really for a good Platonist, the non-material world is the one that matters. It's the series of ideas, it's the plan of the world. Anything you see around you in the material world is a representation, good or not so good, of those plans, those models or ideals. So that's actually flavoured interpretation of the creation week quite heavily at times, and those who've shared that philosophical platform have interpreted the creation week that way. I kind of expected to see these sorts of views very early in the Christian era, but I was surprised to see that they penetrated all the way down, my studies finished in the late 19th century, and there were still biblical commentators like Taylor Lewis in the United States, whose explanations of the creation week were highly Platonist and therefore quite non-literal, and these interpreters that otherwise were quite conservative. So Taylor Lewis is a fascinating example. Conservative biblical commentator, not at all nervous about evolution, not at all literal about the creation week, but not at all radical in his theology either. If you're not a Platonist, it takes a bit of a work of imagination to insert yourself into that mindset. Crucial for Augustine as well, who was a very important commentator. Okay, it was very popular in the history of the church at times and in streams to interpret the creation week as an allegory about realities about Christ or theology more generally. There was a figure called Anastasius of Sinai. I suppose he must have lived in Sinai, around about 700. And his statement was, "These things are a great mystery, but I'm referring to Christ and the church." So he had taken a text from the end of Ephesians and used that as his interpretive key to make sense of texts like Genesis. So was the physical origin of the world of interest to him? Not remotely. Very little sign of that. He was a theologian, and he saw that using the tool of allegory, you could unpack theological truths from Genesis 1. There are theological truths there that don't need allegory as well, of course. Historical typology. I don't know if you're familiar with this one. Have you come across the idea that in the Christian sphere, in earlier times, the world's history would take 7,000 years? Interested to know if you've come across that. Okay, brand new on you. Okay, it'll change your life. All right. The understanding was that, and this is a good illustration of the interpretive key once again, taking the statement from Psalms 90 verse 4 and 2 Peter 3, somewhere, where it says that to the Lord 1,000 years is as a day and vice versa. Interpreters from ancient times really loved finding a key like this that they felt unlocked the meaning of a complex text like Genesis 1. And so that key was applied to Genesis 1 from very, very early Christian writings in the Apostolic Fathers, a book called the Letter to Barnabas, the Epistle to Barnabas. And in that letter, that key is applied to Genesis 1, and each day of creation is taken to be a code for 1,000 years of human history. It helped that you had significant figures turning up in the biblical narrative at about 1,000-year intervals. And so these folk would come up with a scheme where at the junctions between the 1,000 years, you'd have a famous figure like Noah or Abraham or Moses, and they would inaugurate a distinct new era. There'd be something characteristic about the period of history they ushered in. Now, even in around 500 AD, the Christian world was still pumping out writings, and at that time, the Greek church, based on its Septuagint, its Greek Old Testament, was anticipating the return of Christ on the basis of this model. So their biblical chronology said there were about 5,500 years BC, different from the Hebrew text. And based on that, and given a few more centuries of their own existence of the church, there was an air of great expectancy about the return of Christ. And it was all helped by having this model of human history that worked on the basis of 7 times 1,000 years. I have an idea really that there was a period around 1800 where that was converted into a way of viewing geology as well. When geology was felt to be possible to explain in terms of thousands and years rather than millions, there were 1 or 2 interpreters who attempted to do it that way with the days of creation. Okay, so we'll talk about historical typology. A little bit stranger again, there's always been a mystical strand, and it's not really unique to the Christian world, but mystics have turned up in the church as well. Either way, Genesis 1 as a rather pregnant, enigmatic text has really appealed to the mystics of history, and they've often felt that it was the text that didn't just make statements about physical creation, but concealed all mysteries. And so those who viewed themselves as being blessed with insight into the way the world really was constructed, and no one else really knew, it was just them, Emanuel Swedenborg and Jacob Boehme and Rudolf Steiner, after whom the Steiner schools are named, they all taught and talked about Genesis 1 using their personal mystical insights to unpack all the mysteries that were in there. At times that blends into the Platonist way of viewing things as well. So that has influenced Genesis interpretation for quite some centuries. And more generally, just moral allegory. It's very popular. I suppose many of the Christian thinkers were preachers, and many of their works on Genesis 1 were not theoretical works for the academy. They were actually works intended for the church. And so interpreters, well, many of the works in the patristic period particularly, the era of the church fathers, by John Chrysostom and Ambrose and Basil, they were Genesis sermons, a long series of sermons on Genesis 1. And so they felt compelled, I think, and wanted to, they're inwardly compelled, to come up with life application for their audiences, to say something that was going to matter in the everyday. When you read Chrysostom's Genesis sermons, he'll tell off his congregation for going to the races the day before instead of showing up at church. I get the impression they're supposed to come every day, which is pretty heavy. But it was fairly common, even within the framework of a literal interpretation of Genesis, to unpack the elements of the text as symbols. So in speaking about birds, and Genesis really just lists birds in a very generic way, these writers or speakers would then unpack what the moral significance might be of the crane or the stork, or based on their behaviour. Even the phoenix and things like that would show up, of course, things that weren't actually real. So the symbols were an avenue to examination of the Christian life, if you like, or Christian character. And that was not hard to do when the way the world was viewed was symbolically, that everything corresponded to something else. We have a very flat, kind of one-dimensional view of the world, and it's often a very physical view. I suppose as Christians we could be accused of being dualists, at least, physical and spiritual. But in the medieval and the ancient eras, there were many more than two layers to the world. It was a whole stack of layers, and people expected the elements of one layer to correspond to the elements of another. So they looked at the world very naturally in that way. So this tree stump is effectively my attempt to give a cross-section of our tree and to try and ask what sorts of questions were people asking from Genesis 1. The kind of question you're asking affects the kind of answer you get, and I think Chris Mulheron already brought that out. You can get some disappointing answers if you ask questions that are totally unsuited to the text. But this might help us to understand that it's the interpretive world's a bigger one than what we've been personally used to. Okay, so it's a way of saying, I want the biblical text to speak to my external reality. How am I going to bring those into conversation? Otherwise it's not relevant. It has nothing to say. So if it has something to say, I've got to bring my external reality into conversation with the text of Genesis 1. And the first thing I can do is ask physical questions. If my view of the world is very physical and I'm interested in knowing how it originated, I personally am kind of interested in that, then I tend to bring to Genesis physical questions. Natural philosophy, science, those sorts of questions. And you might be thinking, what other kinds of questions are there? Well, there are a few others. I could ask more metaphysical or philosophical questions. These are really very important down through interpretive history. If you read what was really, I think, Luther's textbook in the classroom, you read his Genesis commentary, and he refers his students occasionally to Nicholas of Lyra's Postilla. And there's a saying that if Lyra hadn't played the tune, Luther wouldn't have danced. There's an influence that can be seen there. Nevertheless, those kinds of texts, the thing that they felt compelled to explain was, how do we interpret Genesis 1 in terms of Aristotelian metaphysics? Aristotle's way of describing the world. And your view of the creation week then tends to come out fairly timeless. You're not really interested in historical progression because history doesn't matter very much under those terms. You're asking about what's the fabric of the world, what's the structure of the heavens, what is the really real? Different questions. You might ask historical questions. So when those questions have been important, that world week typology we talked about, 1,000 years equals a day, that has been important. And more simply, perhaps you'd be more inclined to take the creation week literally as the first step in the history that the Old Testament collectively tells. Okay, you might be interested in theological questions, and in that case you might be saying, well, I simply want to know what's the truth about God. I'm not interested in time, I'm not really interested in space and matter. I want to know what's true about the nature of God, the relations within the Trinity, these sorts of questions. Christ's role in creation, perhaps. Those things become important. You might be interested in how to inwardly ascend to God. The goal for a lot of these writers or thinkers was that the highest reality, the best thing you can do, highest achievement is contemplation of God, contemplation of the divine. Kind of an inward, the culmination of meditation, you might say. And so Genesis, the 7 days were interpreted in terms of 7 steps in the ascent of the soul. That's probably fairly unfamiliar to many of you, I think, but actually it's a little bit like some New Age belief, it's a little bit like Eastern meditation, and it's a strand of Christian practice that was really quite important. So Bonaventure in the Middle Ages, he responds to the more physical or the more philosophical treatments by saying, look, that's not the most important thing we need to get from Genesis. The most important thing is, how can the soul ascend to God by stages? Okay, so that might be a stretch for your mind a little bit. Another one is this hermetic or occult knowledge. This sense that there's a lot more to the world than we know about, and if I can just unpack cryptic texts, I can find out what those things are. I don't think Genesis 1 would be the cryptic text that a mystic would choose today, but for a long time it was. It was felt to hold all secrets, but only the mystic had the key. And often they felt it was their God-given calling in life to tell the rest of the world what they alone knew. They would spend their life preaching. So Emanuel Swedenborg, he was a classic Enlightenment scholar really, or a pre-Enlightenment scholar. He was just studying the world in physical ways. He had his mystical moment, and from that time on he committed his life to unpacking the meaning of the hidden world, the occult world, what angels do in their spare time, this kind of thing. Okay, so that is to say, we can't understand interpretations until we understand the motivations that lie beneath them, and that applies certainly to an ancient writer or speaker, and it applies to ourselves as well. So it's a great trend actually in the biblical scholarship world to look now at what other people did when they interpreted the Bible, but that's really not to abandon the hope of interpreting a scriptural text oneself, but it does give a unique perspective on the way that we read. So we seem to be born with a certain illusion of objectivity. We imagine the way we look at things is the way they ought to be looked at, and since we can bring other people's thinking into line, the better the world will be. The longer we go on, the more we realise that perhaps we don't abandon, I wouldn't abandon, the realism of truth that Chris was talking about, and I do think that it would be very difficult for science if realism is abandoned to utter relativity. But we do realise that there are some conditioning factors in the way that we interpret the world and the way we interpret biblical text. So looking at the way other people do and seeing how strange it is at first is not a bad little corrective for our own personal illusions of objectivity. So what can we say about the career of the Creation Week? It's really been a fascinating and for me in a sense as a Christian it's a rather bittersweet story. It came from obscurity by the time of the writings of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century in the Christian sphere. It was rising to dominance around the time that Augustine wrote his Genesis commentary. There were a burst of them. Basil's sermons came out, Ambrose' sermons came out, Chrysostom's sermons were about that time. There was a flurry of interest around about 400 AD in the meaning of the Genesis text. If you were writing in the late Middle Ages an encyclopedia, you wrote it very strongly aware of Genesis 1. And right the way up into the 1800s, you could write a Genesis commentary that seemed to get away with itself because mention of birds allowed you to say everything you could possibly find out about birds, and mention of light would allow you to say everything that was known about optics. And you'd see this in commentaries in the Middle Ages, Newton's time. You'd see Genesis commentaries that really attempted to cater for the scope of all knowledge. For a time there, it's popular to do the same thing historically. To begin your treatment of world history, and to try and treat the whole of world history, but to begin it with creation, chapter 1. Until a certain scepticism comes in the 18th century, a caution and a drawing back from treating Genesis as history. So, how can we account for this trajectory? I just want to think in terms of a few factors and a few reasons. So the modern age witnessed a move to, and these are philosophical things here, singularity of meaning. So we're the exception, our age, in viewing that there's just one meaning in a biblical text or just one meaning in some item of the world, one causal explanation. Most of the time in Western history, multiple explanations and multiple meanings have been the order of the day. Augustine, you read his treatment on interpretation, including very specifically applied to Genesis 1. Very comfortable with different readers coming and getting different meanings from it. That's not always the tone in the church world, that multiple meaning is a comfortable thing, and we need to question it, but that's been more common than singularity of meaning in our interpretation. Secondly, the physicality of truth. Really dominantly, the physical world was not the height of all truth, and material behaviour, material explanations were not the height of all truth for most of this period. They were viewed as an inferior kind of truth. Certainly some interpreters would basically say, why would you stop at letting Genesis 1 tell you about the origin of the world? You know, that's like eating the wrapper of the lolly and leaving the lolly. So truth being physical, that is the flavour more commonly now, but perhaps that's why, you know, scientists and thorough postmodernists don't get on very well, because there's different views of what truth matters as truth. Is the highest truth physical truth? And then one change was the multiplicity of ancient testimony. So I think for a while there, many of our interpreters were actually very good scholars, and they were the greatest minds of their age in many cases. But with the Renaissance and the advent of printing, ancient texts from, you know, Greco-Roman texts and eventually ancient Near Eastern texts, other things that talked about creation, other things that resembled Genesis 1 in certain ways or accounted for the same things, began to appear on the scene. And I think the sheer multiplicity of the evidence began to introduce questions and doubts in people's minds. And there was we're always a little bit enthralled by what is new and different. And you've heard about the Jesuit scholars who went to China to evangelise China and were fascinated to discover that China's own chronology of its past extended back beyond where the flood should have happened, based on Hebrew chronology. And those sorts of discoveries that were rather unexpected, I think, and represented a multiplying abundance of cosmogonies or accounts of the beginning of the world, they created a bit of a worldview crisis for Christians in the Renaissance and into the modern era. They had more than one account of the way things went. And then the historicality of nature. There's been much written on the emergence of the historical mind. It's always been with us to some extent, because those Antiochian people that I talked about, they had a rather historical mind. They did look at the world as historical along with metaphysical and so forth. But there definitely was a trend in the modern era to begin to understand nature as having a history. So the default understanding, maybe about the time of the Reformation, 1500 or so, would have been essentially to treat world history or earth history and human history as coterminous in their beginning at about the same time. So there was not viewed as being a period of pre-human earth history. So with meditations on the meaning of fossils and other things that happened in the 1600s, 1700s, there began to be a sense that, oh, actually nature has a history. Now Augustine told you could go to the city of Hippo and you could see the bones of giants down there. You know, if you didn't believe that giants had existed, like the Bible said, you could go down to Hippo and see them. Well, they weren't human bones, were they? But people had dinosaur bones around and megafauna bones for a long time. Haven't really known how to interpret them sometimes. There was one guy in the early 1700s who famously interpreted the skeleton of a giant salamander as a man who drowned in the flood. But as these things became apparent, the perception dawned that nature has a history as well. And that really changed the game, because it meant instead of Genesis just kind of covering the beginning of earth history and the beginning of human history simultaneously, now it had two very different jobs to do if it was going to cover all of knowledge. And those two jobs, those two tasks, world prehistory and human prehistory, were moving apart at a rapid rate in time terms. So why did the spell break? I put it like that because Genesis 1 and more broadly the early chapters of Genesis really held the Western world in thrall as far as explaining the way human history worked. Now, It might still be very powerful for you and for me in different ways, but it's not very powerful for our culture generally. People don't get up every day and think about Genesis 1 somewhere in the course of that day to help them explain the way the world is constructed. Okay? It's a superfluous explanation for many, in many ways. But that was not always the way. So 1500, 1600, even 1700 and some, 1800, it was still a very powerful explanation. By 1900, it was no longer called upon to help you frame science, and really for many, not so in 1800. So Laplace famously said, when he was asked about the place of God in his cosmology, I have no need of that hypothesis. Well, as far as the origin of the material world, the origin of nature and biological things, by about 1800 or 1750, that hypothesis was no longer needed for many. So, why did the spell break? I think it has something to do with expectations. Whenever we're disappointed, this was a revelation, this is a great thing for helping you live well. When you're young, you don't realise this. If you're not happy, you've been disappointed. If you've been disappointed, you've expected something that you didn't get. And then it helps to ask, what was that I expected that I didn't get? Once you understand that, it's a bit easier to take. So I think there's something like that going on with Genesis 1. What was the expectation? What was the understanding, the assumptions that were made about that chapter? So it was expected to comprise, or maybe, taking it more broadly with the following chapters, that they were expected to comprise all truth about natural origins. So anything that could be said about the world should be found in some form in Genesis 1. It was supposed to say everything. It was supposed to say everything about human origins. And then in the following chapters, the origins of civilization. There wasn't expected to be anything significant to say that wasn't said there. So when sailors went out and discovered, yes, indeed, there was a new world and it even had animals in it, not only that, it had people in it. That kind of information was not expected. It was unexpected data from the side. It wasn't suspected from the creation account and from the early chapters of Genesis. It wasn't expected to discover that those misty patches in the sky were not actually fog of some kind. They were nebulae. They called them nebulae at first, and then emerged eventually they were galaxies. If you had a powerful enough telescope, you could resolve them into a whole bunch of little dots, which relativised our own local universe into just the solar system. All unexpected information. Early commentators really try vigorously to describe either how it's somehow anticipated in Genesis but we didn't see it, or else how Genesis can cope with it. I remember reading one fellow who said in the 19th century, well, I reckon we can say the sun's about a million miles away from us. That's about the outer limits. And you could tell that his conception of Genesis was a whole universe about 1 million miles wide was about all he thought it could cope with. That was the dimensions that seemed suitable as a maximum. The whole geographical scope of humanity also is expected to be explained there. So I think this has been a culture's disappointment. I think it's been a worldview shock of the previous 400 years or so. And I think it may be a misunderstanding of the purpose and the nature of Genesis 1. So it's a little bit silly to be disappointed. How did I put it? Disappointed in a telescope because it doesn't work very well as a microscope, or an architect's house plan because it doesn't give you a sense of three-dimensionality of the house, or a scalpel because it doesn't make a very good shovel. We've got to ask ourselves, what were we expecting? What did we think it would do? What did we think it could do? Were those realistic expectations? So what does it do? Or I don't want to leave us with an air of disappointment when we read Genesis 1 compared to its neighbours from the ancient world, because it is an ancient text. There's no getting around that. It was never going to be modern. If we expected it to tell us in detail about the stages of Big Bang cosmology or evolutionary theory or anything like that, what we were asking it to do is to be incomprehensible to its original audiences for 2,000 years or more. Now, is that what we were expecting? That Genesis 1 would be crystal clear to us and speak all the language that we currently speak, but completely opaque to anyone 200 or 300 years after us? and anyone more than 500 years before us. We're a blip in time, and it's a text that has to speak to people of all ages. So I actually think it's really admirable for its versatility. When you pull out the most famous rival, the one that for a while Genesis 1 was said to be derived from Enuma Elish, you compare the two texts, you read them both, and you ask which one has the versatility to still communicate the realities of creation to a much, much later audience. Enuma Elish is not it. Okay, it's all about how the world was made from a split carcass of a god. And the story culminates in Marduk becoming the god of Babylon. It's very local, it's very obsolete, it's very obscure culturally, and that's not the way Genesis 1 is. So it's uniquely designed to proclaim in every age the power and the sole authorship of God in creation, creation's goodness, purposefulness, orderliness and glory as it reflects God's intentions. And there's no other way that I can imagine that it could have been written and still have achieved those ends.